Years of experience have taught me that it's good to have something between you and the people who are listening to you. It's also good to have an exit behind you. That's a good thing too. So it's good to be back and to have you back and to see you again. I hope that maybe you had some conversations here and there with each other about the material that we covered last week. And we're not going to redo all that. I just want to hit the last piece that we looked at briefly to remind you of where we left off. We were talking about 1968 as sort of the hinge year between the modern era and the postmodern era. And again, not everything happened in 1 year so that it suddenly everything changed. It's more like that trip from Indiana to Florida where you're in southern Georgia and then northern Florida, and northern Florida looks a lot like southern Georgia. It takes quite a while before it becomes what you think of iconically as being Florida. So we were talking about the difference between the modern era and the postmodern, and we were looking at this chart. And on the left side are things that were typical of the modern era, and on the right side are corresponding things as they became typical of the postmodern era. So in the modern era, physics was seen as rather static, and it was the world of Newton, and things added up according to Newton's math, but there was something larger going on that Newton did not grasp that Einstein did, and that's what we know of as relativity. And relativity started out in physics, but by the middle of the 20th century, the concept of relativity had found its way from physics into art. So if you look at some of the postmodern artists like Dali, you see pictures that reflect that postmodern view of the world. It also found its way into ethics, so that before 1968, people tended to think ethically in terms of right or wrong. Murder's either right or wrong, and generally it was considered to be wrong under any circumstances. But as ethics came to relativity, and the first book that reflected this came out in the early 1970s, called Situation Ethics. It could have been Relativity Ethics. But in situation ethics, it raised questions about black and white ethics. So one of the illustrations often used is a family is hiding a Jewish family in their attic. Stormtroopers come in, and there's a baby in that Jewish family that is making a racket and won't quiet down. And ultimately, in order to save the other members of the family, 7 or 8 other members of that Jewish family, the child is smothered to protect everybody else. Well, strictly speaking, in terms of the Bible, you'd have to call that murder, because the child was deliberately smothered to death. But in situation ethics, you have to ask the question, was it worth it? Was it appropriate to smother the baby in order to save the other 7 or 8 members of that family from the Nazis? Because they would have all surely been arrested and ended up in a concentration camp. We don't have to answer that question here today. It's just to say that relativity began to find its way into ethical issues. Right now, I think we struggle with this some, and it's not like this is the first time this has ever come up, but I think it comes up frequently these days. Is it worth it to tell a lie in politics in order to be able to stay in office? Especially if you have some good thing that you're trying to accomplish as a politician. Is it ethical for you to lie in order to stay in office so you can do that good thing? We're struggling a lot right now with where those boundaries are between truth and falsehood and value and so forth. So in postmodern life, ethical questions have become more open and more difficult in many ways than they were before 1968. We talked about in the modern world, things tended to be kind of lined up the way, frankly, we white males like to have them lined up. We like to have our ducks in a row. And after 1968, there were more than just white men who were controlling things, and things began to take a different shape. And an example of a place where you don't have your ducks in a row is the internet, which is really messy. If you look at a diagram of the internet, there's not equal-sized hubs that are equal distant from each other and so forth. There's hubs all over the place of different sizes, different distances from one another. So the internet itself is sort of an example of the world as it's thought of in the postmodern era. In the modern world, nation states were the primary determining factor of what was going on in the world. But after 1968 and the advent of communication satellites, four things have been prime movers in world relationships. Nation states still play an important role, but ethnic groups have increasingly become important. Mass communication itself has become very important, and the market has become very important. And these are all hooked up to each other in ways that transcend national boundaries. If you look at the Earth from space, which is where communication satellites are, there are no national boundaries, right? You see the Earth, but you don't see any national boundaries, and that's kind of the way the postmodern world sees the world. So things that are happening in China, if they're burning a lot of coal in China, the particulate matter in the atmosphere goes up all around the world. So national boundaries don't stop coal particulate matter. Or if there were a nuclear explosion like there was at Chernobyl, that radioactivity does not stop at the border. It drifts wherever the wind carries it. In the modern world, authority was granted by office. So if you were a teacher, pupils were supposed to pay attention to you because the office of teacher was an authoritative office. And they feared going to the principal's office, an even higher authority. But in the postmodern world, authority is not granted so much by office as it is by relationship. So teachers nowadays have to win over their children so that the children understand the teachers have their best interests in heart and are trying to help them. And that can be a pretty tough sell, especially if they come out of a home where there's nobody expressing that kind of concern for them. They become pretty hardened sometimes. But that's the way it is in a postmodern setting. And we still have classes of 30 and 35 kids without that formal authority that being a teacher gives you. And it's pretty hard to maintain those kinds of relationships with 30 or 35 kids. So it's pretty problematic, but that's the way it is in the postmodern world. People in the modern world related to each other through institutions. So they became part of not only churches, but lodges and social clubs and neighborhood clubs and so forth, whereas in the postmodern world, people prefer direct person-to-person or couple-to-couple relationships. So young couples, for example, these days are not very interested in his becoming a Shriner and her becoming Eastern Star. That was something that was attractive to couples 75 years ago, but not so much now, and so that kind of an institution has suffered as a result. There was, in the modern era, a broad social consensus. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant males pretty much ruled the world, but now there is no single social consensus, and there are many voices at the table. From a justice perspective, this is good, but it does make institutional life much more difficult when you have so many different voices with so many different perspectives. In the modern era, communication was formal and indirect. In the postmodern world, it's much less formal and more direct. So I'm 75, but I'm on a first-name basis with students that I teach at seminary, for example. Whereas 75 years ago, or even 50 years ago, that wouldn't have flown very well unless I gave my permission for that. But now the assumption is that I'll relate to him as first name. And I got enough postmodern in me that that's okay with me. But I think sometimes that bothers others. In the modern world, we thought progress is inevitable. In fact, General Electric had a motto that said, progress is our most important product. They no longer have that motto. Now I think there may be a newer iteration yet. They went from that motto to, we bring good things to life, which makes a kind of promise, but it doesn't promise progress. And so in the postmodern world, progress is not something that's assumed. People who came home from World War II had a strong feeling that everything was going to get better and better, and there was going to be progress on all fronts. But people who came home from the Vietnam War were not convinced that everything was going to get better and better. And now, progress or no progress is really up for grabs in many ways. So some people remain optimistic about climate change, that we'll find some technological way to overcome that issue. But lots of other people are not so sure that we might not be looking at the end of the planet as far as human habitation is concerned. So a lot of different ideas out there. And we should say, again, it's like Indiana to Florida. There's lots of folks who are more modern in their outlook. Some of them are young people. And there's lots of people who are postmodern in their outlook. And so we see this interplay, or interplay might not be the right word, this confrontation constantly between modern and postmodern views and understandings. That's the nature of the world we live in. Okay. So that's a little bit of a review of modern versus postmodern. So when you think about the church, the attractional model is the one that functioned in the modern era in the United States. So you made your building as attractive as you could. You stationed welcoming greeters at the door and had ushers to get people to a seat. And you did everything you could to make people feel welcome so they would come back. But we now live in a place, in a time, where nobody's coming to visit out of the blue. The first stop they will make typically is the web. If they're actually looking for a church, they will go to the internet and look up your church and see what you represent, what you stand for, and how you operate, and then make a decision as to whether they want to visit you or not. And then they'll come, and the first question that they'll want to answer is, okay, does the reality of this congregation stack up with the internet presentation that they had? Does their web page look like them? Or is this something that's just been finessed by somebody who knows how to do a really good web page? Okay. So the attractional model doesn't function for many people. There are young people who grew up in disciple churches or other mainline churches who do decide that they want to go back to the church, or they want to find a church where their children will learn the faith or something. That I don't know what percentage of young people that is, but I'm guessing it's something around 10%. They're the ones who will snoop around on the internet and find a place close by that looks like a candidate for their church to belong. But the other 90% probably don't really even know that your church exists. They might recognize it if somebody said, that church down the street that has the pantry and the steeple, you know, that church. Or, as I was relating last week, it irritated me, that church that's just down the street from McDonald's. Oh, yeah, okay. They know where McDonald's are, so now they know where my church is. I'd like to think that McDonald's would say, we're the church just down the road from First Christian Church, but it's the other way around. So rather than that attractional model of trying to get people to come to you for the first time, the church has to take its community, its neighborhood, very seriously. That means finding out who lives there and what their needs are, and trying to reach out to them, meeting them where they are with programs, ministries that appeal to them. So you still have to attract them, but you have to attract them from where they are, not get them to come to where you are and then attract them. Does that make sense? So figuring out who lives in your neighborhood and what the needs here are is very important. A lot of times, as a consultant, one of the things I always did with congregations was to help them do a neighborhood study. And I was always amazed how people in the church really thought they knew their neighborhood. They thought they knew who lived there. Then you do a real study of who lives there, and you find out, oh, what they know is who lived there 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And today, the people that live there are very different from the people that the congregation remembers living there when they used to be able to do the attractional model. So there's no substitute. That's one of the things I hope you'll take away from this seminar. There's no substitute for a good, solid study of your neighborhood to see who actually lives there and how they're the same or different from you, and thinking through, okay, so what would God want us to do with and for these people, given who we are and given who they are? It'll give probably a different answer than just keeping the carpets clean and the parking lot striped and having a greeter and the things that we used to focus on so much, because we could do it that way. So that's the attractional model versus the missional model, moving into a model in which you're reaching out into your community rather than just holding out, waiting for the community to come to you. Next slide. So let's talk about these generational changes that I've been teasing you with. I always like to give credit to Morris Massey because he was the first person I ever heard talk about generations in this way. And now there's several other socioscientists who are known for their work in this area. But Massey was one of the first. So, next slide. He always said, what you are is what you were when. So it depends on when you grew up as to how you see the world. When you grew up, as to how you see the world. Now, as we talk about these generations, you've heard these names before, I'm sure. We have to say not everybody acts their age, okay? So there are some people who are silents, but who think like Generation Y. And there are some people in Generation X who think like builders. But generally speaking, the categories I'm about to give you are true enough on average that they're a useful construct as we think about people and how they see the world. Okay? So let's talk about builders for a minute. The builder generation, born between 1915 and 1930, also called by people like Tom Brokaw the greatest generation. I would submit to you that I'm a little uncomfortable with that kind of labeling because I don't think any generation is necessarily greater than another generation. Every generation has its strengths and its temptations and weaknesses. Every generation has those. I think the reason we talk about the builders as the greatest generation was because they rose to the challenge of World War II in a truly amazing way. And in that sense, they were pretty great. They did what they had to do. But think about where these people grew up. If what you are is who you are is what you were when, where you were when, these folks growing up in the teens, at that time, most of the United States population was living on farms and in small towns. There were, of course, big cities, but most Americans lived on farms and in small towns. And lots of families were pretty large for a couple of reasons. One, because there was no birth control, and two, or at least no birth control pills. And two, if you lived on a farm, children were something of an economic asset. They could work on the farm and increase production and increase income and so forth. So they could sort of pay their own way on the family farm. They had that going for them. But when they were very young, early teens, the Depression came along. Some of them even were not born until the Depression because it's between 1915 and 1930. So the Depression came along when they were very young, and at that point they became very focused on helping their families survive. Many of them took jobs in town or wherever they could find them. They learned to work very early, to take responsibility very early in their lives. So they were exceedingly, as a generation, exceedingly responsible people. And they were very focused on the local. How can I help take care of my family? But then World War II came along in 1941, when the oldest of these people were about just age to go to the military. Pearl Harbor happened, and all of a sudden their worldview was entirely turned over. And instead of focusing on the local, they began to understand themselves as being involved in a global crusade, really, to save democracy, to save decency, to save civilization over against the Nazis and the Japanese Empire and so forth. That we call World War II a good war because there were clear enemies, and it clearly made a difference for us to win that war. And these people rolled up their sleeves. They went to the service, and they went to the factories to produce munitions and other kinds of wartime goods, and they got the job done. Next slide here shows Rosie the Riveter, which is a poster that we're all familiar with. It wasn't only the men, it was also the women who went to work, went to war, and won that war. What this did for that generation was shift their perspective, their worldview, from very localized on what's happening here in my town, on my farm, and so forth, to a global perspective. They understood themselves to be saving the world, essentially. And in some senses, they were. And they were caught up in this mass movement of mobilization to win that war. And the thing that they came away with from that was a sense of being a part of something larger than themselves. So they went from this very local view to a view of being a part of something much larger than themselves. And that generation never really got over that. I mean, they liked being a part of something larger than themselves. So they loved institutions and clubs and all kinds of organizations. When the soldiers came home from World War II and the factory workers came home from the factories, they started huge numbers of congregations and synagogues and social clubs and Little League Baseball and just about every kind of organization you can think of that would serve their social needs and those of their children and their family as a whole. So if you look at the church multiplication, or when the church has grown the fastest, it's most often we point to the 1940s and the middle 1950s, where the church just really took off. Not only the disciples, but all mainline churches took off then as they started new congregations in the suburbs. By and large, World War II generation people, the builders, did not go home to the farm. Most of them, having seen some part of the world, were interested in something other than farming, which wasn't, farming in those days, in the 1940s and 50s, was still just plain hard work. You didn't have GPSs to guide your tractor down the row and so forth. It was just hard work. And so a lot of these young people coming back from the war and the factories opted for jobs in the city, for careers of some kind. Many of them went to school to get a degree of some kind, but many of them learned skilled trades and so forth. So this is when the urbanization of America really took off. And pretty soon there were more people living in the cities than there were in the country. And you can only divide a farm so many times. The Amish have this problem because they have the family plot that is so many acres, and they have children, and in their religious traditions and so forth, farming is pretty much the main thing that's offered to them as an option. Well, after you've subdivided the farm among a generation of sons, and then you subdivide them all again among their sons, you're farming pretty small plots. And that's why a lot of us have big recreational vehicles and trailers that are made by Amish people, because those young men go to Elkhart or go to other cities where they can get jobs because they know how to build things, they know how to use their hands. And so you see that taking place in a way across the country. We call them builders because they were builders. They built institutions, they built cities, they built suburbs, they built roads, they built about anything you can name. So there's a very large generation numerically. There were a lot of members of the builder generation. There might be a builder or two in the room. Does this sound to you about right, what I'm talking about here? Actually, I think most of the people in the room are probably silents. If you're older, you're probably silents or boomers. Yeah. Well, I'll ask the question again in a minute, because the silent generation, which followed the builders, were not old enough to fight in the war or to work in the factories, but they were old enough to know what was going on. They understood what the war was about, and so they were really, along with their older brothers and sisters, or in some cases their parents, they were baptized into this view of the world about being a part of something larger than yourself, the value of institutions and so forth. Silence born between 1930 and 1945. Unfortunately for them, the Korean War was the war they had to fight, which was a much less clear war than World War II. And if you're going to fight a war, it's a whole lot easier to fight a war that you're clear about the purpose of. But the silence, like the boomers after them, had to fight a war where the causes were not so clear. Silence, go back there just for a minute. Silence have the same value system, though, as builders. It's a much smaller generation numerically. There are many fewer silents than there are or were builders, as we're losing builders every day. A relatively small generation, so that there was, in a wartime economy, unlike the farm economy when the builders were built, wartime economy, having 6 or 8 or 10 kids made no sense at all. So families got smaller. People had 1 or 2 kids and stopped, typically. So the silent generation was a much smaller generation. The other thing we say about silence is that when their older siblings and parents came home from the war and the factories, they just about sucked all the oxygen out of the air. They were the ones, the builders were the ones that started corporations, and the silent generation sort of inherited those enterprises, but not the CEO roles, typically. So the silents ended up sort of managing the stuff that was created by the builder generation, while the builders themselves remained the CEOs. So the silents are a generation of excellent, by and large, excellent managers. They do it well. And that was the hand they were dealt, and they took it on, and they became really excellent managers. Now we have, again, not everybody acts their age. So you have somebody a silent like Ted Turner, who started CNN and all of that. He was a silent. So there were silents who were CEOs and who did create organizations of various kinds. But that would have been a minority of the silent generation. More of them tended to be managers. Why do we call them the silent generation? Well, that's why we call them the silent generation. When the culture started looking for CEOs as builders reached retirement, they skipped over the silent generation by and large and went to early boomers. They skipped over the silent generation and went to early boomers. Not fair, but that's what happened. And so, for example, we have not had a president of the United States until just now who was a silent. We skipped over from Eisenhower into the builder generation, and then from Kennedy we skipped over into the boomer generation to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and so forth. So in a lot of ways, because it was a small generation, because it was focused largely on management, they were overlooked as leaders often in the culture as a whole. So go back just another second. We'll look at the baby boomers then are born 1945 to 1965. And a lot of people want to talk about early boomers and later boomers, and there's a reason for that. The first half of the boomers are more cynical and more angry than the second half of boomers. But baby boomers generally are known to not be real happy with the culture that they inherited. So now let's go to the next picture here. 45 to 65 are their birth years. So as they're becoming young adults, these early boomers, they're right square in the middle of the changeover from modern to postmodern. And so think about 1968. 1968, the Vietnam War was at its height. We had 500,000 soldiers. The United States had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Next slide. It was the time of not only the peace movement, but it was also a time, and one more slide. And if you haven't been to the wall in Washington, you really ought to visit it sometime. I think it's very touching. When I first heard about it, I thought, boy, that's terrible. This wall that kind of is in the ground and comes up and so forth. But it just captures so well my generation's feelings about the Vietnam War. Next slide. Here's the camaraderie of soldiers in that war. Next slide. In addition to the Vietnam War, which was very disillusioning because the government couldn't give a really clear reason for it, the civil rights movement was getting underway. In Montgomery with the bus boycott, and then in Birmingham and Nashville, Jackson, all around the South. And ultimately it came to Chicago and other cities in the North. And the civil rights movement was really disillusioning for a lot of young boomers because white boomers had grown up in white schools because of Jim Crow. And so we'd been raised to think that white people were doing a great job of running the country and everybody was in great shape. And so when we saw what was happening in places like Montgomery or Selma or other places on TV over dinner, it was very disorienting first, and then it was disillusioning, and finally it was maddening to boomers. And so you remember some of these pictures, whip through these a little bit here. Birmingham Fire Department. If you haven't been to Birmingham for a long time, Birmingham's a very different city now, but the park where they used to stage demonstrations and so forth and where this kind of stuff happened is still there, and a lot of good history that you can read as you walk around that square block park. And in 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. He was there to support the garbage workers' strike, you remember? And I know where I was that day because I was downtown at Broadway Park where Robert F. Kennedy was in town campaigning. And that night, most of us we didn't carry cell phones in those days. Most of us had not heard the word about Robert Kennedy. And so Kennedy made the announcement that night to those of us in that audience. There were several thousand people there, including a lot of African Americans. A remarkable speech that he gave off the cuff that night, often credited with the fact that Indianapolis was one of the few large cities in the country that didn't have fires and riots that night. But fires and riots broke out in many other parts of the country. And then right after that, Kennedy himself was assassinated. And, you know, in many ways, I mean, this is not partisan politics because teenagers don't know much about partisan politics. You know, they just know who they sort of lionize, who their heroes are. Jack Kennedy had been a sort of a hero because he seemed to offer a hopeful vision that would take us as a nation from the post-war era into an era of prosperity and justice. And so when Kennedy was assassinated, many of these same boomers, including yours truly, were 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. That really hit us hard because he was our president, most of us. And now when his brother was killed, it was just like reliving that whole nightmare again. So that was pretty traumatic for boomers. Then there was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, in which Mayor Daley, the old Mayor Daley, the father, called in police people from all over that part of the country to come and help to make sure that nothing untoward happened during the Democratic National Convention. He didn't want to be embarrassed as a Democrat by what might happen at the Democratic National Convention if all these rioters and so forth, protesters and everything came. There were so many police there that some journalists described it as a police riot rather than as a protesters' riot. The police came and hit a lot of people on the head, dragged a lot of them away, took them to jail and so forth. Not a very pretty picture. But at the end of 1968, there was sort of a moment of redemption, I guess. One really positive thing that happened that year was Apollo 8 circumnavigated the moon. And the amazing thing about this was, it was Christmas time, you remember this? If you're like me, you were watching when this happened. And I was just thrilled. At that point, I decided probably I was going into ministry. I was thrilled when they read Genesis from the Apollo capsule orbiting the moon, something you probably wouldn't be able to get away with these days. But in those days, they were able to do that. And we saw this iconic picture from Apollo 8 called Earthrise. And, you know, people had never seen the Earth from 200 and some thousand miles away like that, hanging in space. And so not only did this grab people's attention, as you see the Earth with a background of nothingness all around it, which points to its fragility and so forth, it gave birth to the environmental movement. And there have been people, of course, Muir and others for decades and decades that had been environmentalists, but this really gave birth to the movement in 1968. And at the same time, coattailing on the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement got going. This was also just a few years after the birth control pill had been introduced. And this would have a profound impact on the culture. So 1968, friends, was a heck of a year. There was a lot of stuff going on, and you can see why it would be kind of considered a hinge between the modern era and the postmodern era. And everybody's relationship to the culture changed. So young people related to the culture differently, no longer just saluting authority. Women related to the culture differently, no longer just accepting that if their husband was beating them, they had to put up with it. Or if they were sexually harassed at work, they just had to put up with it. Or that a husband could just keep them at home and not allow them any other self-expression, that they just had to put up with that. That all began to change in 1968. And while African Americans were outraged, obviously, by the death of Dr. King, they were also energized in many ways to keep the movement going. So just kind of flip through these a little bit here. Okay. So that's baby boomers. Like the builders, a very large generation because, people came home from the war and they had kids. And they had a lot of kids. And so the baby boom is called the baby boomer generation because there were so many people in it. But immediately after the boomers then came Generation X, sometimes called baby busters. And most Generation X people don't like to be called baby busters because it's sort of like naming them after the opposite of the baby boomers, and they're their own people. So Generation X is probably the preferred name for this generation, born between 1965 and 1982. Early on, I don't know if you remember this or not, but they were called latchkey kids. And the reason for that was because women had started going to work in significant numbers, and so when kids came home from school, there was no parent in the house. They had to let themselves in. So they were called latchkey kids. If things were well organized, there would probably be a mother or some other parent down the street who was home, and everybody would gather at that house by agreement. So they had adult supervision. But in most cases, they really had no supervision. For a couple of 3 hours, they were on their own. To me, it's amazing that Generation X didn't get into more trouble than they did, because they had that free time in the afternoon where they could do about anything without supervision. They were also often called slackers, and the reason for that was because they were slow to leave the nest. And this is still kind of a joke about younger generations who stay with their parents for an additional 10 or 20 years past the time most boomers would have been out doing their own thing. I don't know how much TV you watch, but there's a commercial on right now that I really like. There's a kid that's about 40 years old that's still living at home, and his parents are trying to get him to move out. And have you seen that commercial? Yeah. I think that's funny. But anyway, probably because I'm not an Xer. They learned some things from their parents. They were the first generation to have personal computers in their home as well as at school. Many of them didn't have them at home, but they did have access to them at school. So they became a computerized generation. They sought a work-life balance, unlike their silent and boomer parents. Silents and boomers just tend to give everything to their job. Part of the disillusionment of Generation X is watching their parents make that kind of effort and then seeing their corporation maybe sold out from under them and they lose their benefits, or the corporations raids their pension fund monies, or other acts that jeopardized the financial future of their parents. They saw that, and it reinforced their distrust of institutions and their unwillingness to give 24/7 to work. So they had more of a work-life balance that they demanded. Sometimes boomers made fun of them for that, but now that I'm 75, I can see the wisdom of what they were talking about. Made a lot of sense. They were not interested in spending hours and hours in meetings, either at work or any place else, including church. Instead, the Xers demanded high productivity and prefers to complete tasks as quickly as possible to free up more personal time. So give me a job, get out of my way, let me do it, and I'll do it. And I'll be done until the next project comes along. They became entrepreneurial, many of them, establishing their own companies like Google, Wikipedia, Amazon, YouTube. Some of these huge, very valuable corporations were founded by Xers. They were not helicopter pilots, or pardon me, helicopter parents, like many of us boomers were, watching over our kids all the time. But they know what's going on with their kids and take an interest in what's going on with their kids. They just don't suffocate them the way some of us suffocated our kids. So that's Gen X. Some of the shaping things that happened in their life included shortages of fuel. They weren't driving yet the first time that happened, but they were in the car and they saw what was happening. I like this. So, that's Generation X. You're an Xer, right? You're a millennial. Sorry. Yep, sorry. Time marches on. Okay. Are there any Xers in the room? Yeah. So, that's Generation X. Generation Y then comes along around 1982. They grew up with PCs in their home, if they had money at all, as well as in their school. And they adopted smartphones. Smartphones came along when millennials were late teenagers, coming of age, and they loved them. Whereas Generation X used email a lot as a new form of communication, millennials latched on to texting as a new form of communication. And the thing about emails can't be full-blown essays or people stop reading them. So they have to be somewhat short to a paragraph or two, or people lose patience with an email. A text can only have a couple dozen words in it, or you run out of space. So being able to reduce things down, some would say oversimplify communication into a few sentences was kind of a shaping force, and millennials don't have a lot of patience for long-winded professors like me, or long-winded preachers, or long-winded anything. They are generally confident. They were raised in a time where there was quite a bit of optimism. They are very tolerant, because by the time millennials come along, we now have people from lots of other countries in the world that have immigrated to the United States and integrated into American culture in large measure, as well as the integration of public schools in most parts of the country. And so they grew up with people who looked different from them, talked different from them, and so that was what they knew. And that was very different from my experience growing up in an all-white high school. And I think they're the better for it. But those of us who grew up before that time, we still struggle. We still struggle with that kind of racial and ethnic diversity. Lots of boomers still telling racist jokes and ethnic jokes and so forth that we learned when we were younger, and it's really kind of time to let go of those. And millennials have no patience for that kind of thing. They distrust institutions like all postmodern generations, network closely with their friends, prefer a team work environment to an individual work environment. They like to have mentors because they figured out some time ago that it's much easier to get smart and up to speed fast if you've got a mentor who has experience ahead of you to share that with you. So they like to have mentors. They like to have personal relationship with their supervisors, and they like immediate feedback, and they like a lot of feedback. They like a lot of positive feedback. If they don't get that, then they assume things must be bad because I'm not hearing about the good things. They have what older generations regard as a sense of entitlement because they see no reason to delay being given significant responsibilities at work. Now this is a little passé because most millennials now are in getting into their 40s, and so they've been rising in the food chain for quite a while. But early on, millennials thought, give me a couple of years to figure this out and I'm good to go. Don't talk to me about time and grade. You know that phrase, time and grade, comes out of the military. You do a certain amount of time and you do a certain amount of particular kind of work and then you get a promotion. Millennials have never been much interested in time. They understand the need to master the skills, but they don't see what age or time has to do with that. So, and they got a point. They've got a point. So it's hard to keep this slide current because smartphones change so rapidly. Almost every yeah. Almost every class I teach on this at seminary, which means usually about once a year I do a class that includes this information. No matter what phone I've got up there, the students all laugh because it's a couple of years old, you know. Which I got socks that are a lot older than that. So anyway, so that's Generation Y or millennials. Does that sound about right? All of us in our generations backfill a little bit from the stuff that the next generation brings to the table. So those of us who are always used to writing letters have learned how to use email, and many of us appreciate that very much. A lot of us are still having trouble figuring out how to program our electronic gadgets, and texting befuddles a lot of people. You know, it's kind of frustrating. I send messages to people and they don't get them because it's not on their radar. But to some degree, we all learn some new skills from the generations that follow us. And we're smart to do that. If you get your grandchildren to show you things, because they'll appreciate the fact that they can mentor you in regards to those kinds of issues. What's that? Yeah. In fact, there's a sort of a compatibility particularly between millennials and boomers that's been noticed, because even though they come from, either side of the 1968 divide, millennials are a large generation, like the builders were a large generation, and they appreciate many of the same things. They have a lot in common. And so a lot of times, millennial grandchildren have gotten along better with their grandparents than they have with their parents, because they resonate more with those grandparents than the parent will. Okay, so Generation Z, the last one here, born after 2000, around 2000. These folks are native to postmodern culture. So my grandkids are all teenagers, and I sort of pride myself on keeping up on things electronically. But it's like these guys don't have to learn anything. They just already know it. It was like they were born knowing how these things work, So I'm sitting there trying to figure out, how can I get this DVD player hooked up to this television and get the sound to come out right and so forth. And if I just step aside and give them about 90 seconds, they put it all together and it works, It's maddening. But they're native. They're natives in the postmodern culture. Almost everybody in this room, not everybody, but almost everybody in this room is an immigrant to the postmodern era. But these folks are natives to it. They take racial, ethnic diversity for granted, and they have low tolerance for intolerance. So the quickest way to turn off anybody in Generation Z, or Y for that matter, but especially Z, if you tell any kind of a racist joke or ethnic joke or imply that somebody is a certain way because of their ethnicity or their race, they want none of that. That is a fast turnoff. They distrust institutions like everybody in the postmodern era. They network closely with their friends like like millennials do. They believe in the power of the individual to make a difference. And they like to have freedom to work on their own. They're not so much team-oriented like Y or millennials as they are individual-oriented. And some of these people, some of these Zers are coming up with solutions to problems at the age of 16 that some of the rest of us haven't figured out yet. We've been working on them for decades. They have what older generations regard as a sense of entitlement and see no reason to delay being given significant responsibilities at work. So, again, they don't think age means very much in the sense of worthiness for a position. It's skills that matter, not age. Some of that's always natural, occurs naturally. I think every generation feels like the generation before them is kind of holding them down, and they shouldn't, because they're smart enough and good enough and so forth. As you get older, you do realize that, not everybody gets older and wiser. Some people just get older, but there is some wisdom that comes with age, and there's a place for that too. So, but naturally, they are impatient as youth, and the oldest of them now is about 23. So, they're coming. They're here. Any questions about these groups that I've outlined here? Is this making sense? Let's look at a couple of examples of how these work, how they differ. In terms of communication, my mother was right in the front end of the builder generation. In fact, she's a couple of years ahead of the builder generation. And for her, communication as she was growing up was two longs and a short. They lived on a farm. The telephone was a party line, of course, and you didn't say anything on the phone that you didn't want everybody to know because there was an operator who was listening all the time. There's a joke in my family, and I think it's probably in most families, about a couple of my aunts talking on the phone, and one of them asked a question and the other one didn't know the answer, so the operator piped up and gave the answer. So communication in those days was like that. But as you move on to the builder generation, you have party lines forming that are private operators, not in the rural parts of the country, but in the cities. You begin to move away from operators and more to automatic exchanges and so forth. And finally, with the silence, you begin to have some private telephone lines in the cities only. So if you were a silent and you had a private telephone line, you could talk to somebody without fear of somebody listening in. Boomers, more of us had private lines, although I remember we had about 6 people on our line when I was about 13, and I was trying to talk to a girl, And it got really irritated because the neighbor picked up the phone about 5 different times. And so at some point I told him off, and then I felt bad about it, so I went down and apologized. But it was still a party line. But if you had a private line, you could talk on the phone, and it was private. Then you get to the place where you can begin to do email. And Gen X really picks up on that, Generation X. And Generation Y really picks up on that and on texting. So the options for personal communication and speed of communication and so forth picks up pace as you go through these generations. So now there's a lot of different apps, some of which I've never used or cared to have on my phone. But I know that Generation Z and some Y people are using these other forms of communication that are very quick and very handy. We've reached a point now where most millennials, on a private basis, most millennials and Xers really hate it when people call on the telephone just out of the blue. If you want to talk on the telephone, then make an appointment. You know, think about how different that is from growing up when, the phone's ringing, and the first person to get to the phone, that was a big deal, to get to the phone and see who was calling. But again, we backfill, so I'm a boomer, but I never answer my phone unless I see a name that appears with the number. Because I know 9 times out of 10, if there's no name with the number, it's a solicitor. And if it's not, they can leave a voicemail. I'll check my voicemail right away to make sure it wasn't something that I needed to respond to. But I don't like phone calls either if I don't know they're coming and I don't know who it is. So communication changes over the generations. And I remember as general minister being in the courtyard there in front of St. Peter's in Rome, describing the Christmas decorations to my parents in real time, and that phone call sounded just like I might have been next door calling on the phone. It was perfect audio, and everything was great. But it wasn't until 1968 that you could make a call overseas with anything other than the transatlantic cable. And that was not necessarily a smooth experience. And before the transatlantic cable, there were telegrams. There was no way to really have a real-time conversation overseas. Money, my parents their parents did not trust banks. That was before the builders was a generation that didn't trust banks and institutions in general. But after World War II, builders trusted banks and other institutions. So they wanted to know how much money they had in the bank. Boomers, we wanted to know how much credit we had. And then the joke is that Xers wanted to know how much credit their parents had. But Xers went about getting their own funds. Thank you very much. But attitudes toward money change from generation to generation. Sunday school, if I go into a church like Northwood on Sunday morning, and I walk into a Sunday school class where the chairs are set in sort of a theater arrangement with a table at the front and probably a chalkboard or a pad or something behind them, I know I'm probably in a silent class. It would have been a builder class if it had been 25 years ago, but now it's probably a silence class because that's the way silents do Sunday school. It's institutionalized. When silents were younger, they had institutionalized curriculum that they used. It was staged by age, right? And you used the denominational, that is the institutional curriculum in your class. Bethany graded curriculum, we called it, in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Every denomination had its own version of that. Somewhere around 1968, the curriculum business fell apart, and people no longer were interested in denominational curriculum so much, except the builders still were and the silents still were, but the baby boomers really wanted nothing to do about it. So if I walk into a room and I see there's some circles of chairs, that's probably a baby boomer class, because they mostly like to talk to one another in a small group, and the same would typically be true of X or Y. So Sunday school is done differently by different generations. It's what feels natural and normal to you because that's the way it was being done when you were growing up. Make sense? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I left my watch in the car. How convenient. That's dangerous. Let's take a 10-minute break, okay? An honest 10-minute break. So if we think about the differences between these generations, people over 75 who are mostly modern in their outlook love institutions, including the church, and experience God in and through institutional life. So they come to church to experience God. It's not that they don't necessarily experience God in other ways, in nature and so forth, but their primary way of experiencing God is through institutional life. They tend toward hierarchical forms and beliefs. I don't mean hierarchical in a negative way, but tend to have people serving in roles with various levels of authority. And they think of Christianity as a system of beliefs or doctrine. So they choose a church for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons they choose a particular church is because they agree with the doctrine. And they want to hear that doctrine talked about, generally speaking. And they don't want to hear a lot of things said that don't fit that doctrine, okay? But people under 75, for them, institutions may have some value, but they don't assume that they have value until the institution shows that it has value for them. They experience God in and through relationships. So, small group would be a place where people would be more likely to experience the holy than in a whole institutional setting. Even if you look at something like a rock concert, or any kind of concert, it doesn't have to be a rock, it can be a country western or any other kind of concert. People under 75 tend to go to those because of the relationship they feel to the artists. Not so much because they love Beethoven or Mozart, but because they know and appreciate the artists who are playing that night, and that's what really grabs them. They love mystery and awe. What I would call approximate truth. They live very easily with something that's approximately true if they feel like there's no way to get an absolute definition. They're okay with an approximate definition. Whereas people over 75, not just because they're older, but because they grew up as builders in silence, really want some hard rock truth. And that's the people that watch evangelists on television. They're looking for hard rock truth. They don't like approximate truth. Let's see, go back one more slide there, back. And for them, people under 75, they're not interested in Christianity as a system of beliefs so much, although they don't want the beliefs to be crazy. But they're more interested in Christianity as a way of life. They're looking for a way to live in a relativistic culture that doesn't give them a whole lot of clues a lot of time about how to live. I mean, you know, if you contrast living in a time when right and wrong were black and white, pretty clear, it was pretty easy to know what you were supposed to do, and you did it or you didn't do it. And if you didn't do it, you could get forgiveness, but you knew what you were supposed to do. But in a world like this, a lot of times it's just kind of hard to know what the right thing is. So Christianity for them is a way of life. Let me put this another way. 100 years ago, all the mainline traditions, including the disciples of Christ, assumed that the Bible contained absolute truths that would be an absolute guide as to how to live. But with the rise of biblical scholarship, linguistics, and all the other sciences, archaeology, and so forth, we've realized that the Bible is not one consistent narrative that always says the same thing about everything. You have to parse the scriptures sometimes, or you can get sideways with some other scriptures. So when somebody says to me, well, I like being a disciple because it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe something, I say, no, that's not at all who we disciples are. Basically, what we're trying to do is be like Jesus. We're trying to live like Jesus lived, live the way Jesus taught. We're not so interested about that particular biblical verse, except as it might throw some light on who Jesus was and how he might live in our circumstances. So we're trying to live a Jesus ethic, not trying to live by a rule book so much. It's not to say there aren't some rules in there that are pretty clear, but there's some rules in there that are contradictory also. What we're really looking for is to live a life like Jesus lived, as near as that's possible. Fundamentalism tries to nail everything into short, clear propositions. And mainline churches are more interested in the meaning beyond those short meanings. Does that make sense? That's a little hard to talk about, especially in this culture today, because in this culture today, everybody seems to want you to come up with quick answers about everything, and they don't have much patience with long-winded descriptions. So, people over 75, Christianity is a system of beliefs. People under 75, Christianity is a way of life. But not all of us act our age, okay? So there are people over 75 that are living that way of life, not so concerned about those particularities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Then people over 75 experience God in and through institutions. People under 75 in and through relationships. That's what we just said. The new thing here is people over 75 like to think and talk together about a need and then do something about it, whereas people under 75 like to do something about a need and then think and talk about it together. It's just the opposite approach to problem solving. Who's right? Well, you can do it either way, but you got to be aware that Different groups do it exactly oppositely, and so you have to work together to find your way through that, so that you don't say, oh, your way of doing it is stupid. It's like, okay, your way of doing that's different than mine. Let's talk about how we can find a way forward together. So we have a crisis in church governance, and the problem for Disciples as a very American church is that we tend to think that the way you understand God's will is by taking a vote on it. Is this God's will or not? Well, we don't know, so let's take a vote and see. That's American democracy. But it's not spiritual discernment. Discernment takes a lot of interaction, a lot of thinking, a lot of talking together, even arguing together sometimes. But you hold together until you come to a mutual understanding of what God's will might be in regards to a particular thing. This means, though, if we operate so much on the basis of democracy rather than discernment, then we're constantly dividing ourselves. Every time we take a vote, if there's a significant majority that doesn't see it that way, we've just divided ourselves. Now, that can happen once or twice or 3 times, but if you're on the losing end of votes 4 or 5 times, that begins to get old. And pretty soon you start looking for a church that you think people would vote with you. So we have to be careful about our use of democracy and making that the end all. I would say that an effective chair of a disciples board of any kind, whether it's in a congregation or someplace else, is that you keep working the issue until you're sure that you're as close to a consensus as you can get. Then you take a vote. But you don't take a vote because you think, well, I can get 51% here, so I'm going to go ahead and take that vote. Wait until you can get 90% or more. The decision might be a little different because you're going to benefit from those minority opinions, and you're going to come to a more holistic decision because you took your time to do it. And you're not going to be dividing people every time you take a vote. Now, some things, of course, you can take a vote on and it's not a problem. If everybody agrees that the budget's about what the budget needs to be, then you can vote on the budget in the annual meeting and no big deal. But if you've got some real policy decision in front of you and you know everybody's not on board, then you're not ready to vote yet. You need to take some time to work through that. People say, and interestingly, in this case, it tends to be older people who say, but sometimes younger people too, it just takes so much time to get to consensus. That's true. But it takes a whole lot more time to put together a church that's been broken open by conflict. The church may never get over that. So take an extra year or 2 to work through something till you're ready to move forward together. Does this make sense? We have a crisis in Christian education. It's a very simple crisis. We haven't done any for about 50 years. We're not teaching our children the faith. So it's not too amazing that they don't feel particularly drawn to stay with the church. They don't know whether Noah or Moses came first. They're not sure about a lot of things. Never really cracked the Bible open much. So we're not equipping them, what Paul would call equipping the saints. We're not equipping our young people with knowledge about their own faith. So why would they be strongly committed to a faith they don't know or understand? That's a real crisis. Sometimes you can talk about the difference between modern and postmodern churches in terms of polarities. So a modern church is very concerned about maintenance because of that attractional model. Let's keep the building well maintained. Let's make sure the floors in the fellowship hall are waxed, and let's not do something like have a scout troop inside because those kids will scuff up those floors in the fellowship hall. So you've maintained the fellowship hall, but you just missed a great opportunity for mission. Whereas a postmodern church tends to be more given to mission. In modern churches, the concern is often finance. How do we spend our money? Whereas in a postmodern church that's missionally engaged, does every person in the congregation feel compelled to support this mission? And then we'll live within the means that we have as a result of everybody taking the mission seriously. Modern churches tend to withhold authority. I see this a lot. I've probably done it myself. But it's like you got to prove yourself in this church before you can have any very important office. So if you come for 10 or 15 years, you might get to be a deacon. If you mind your P's and Q's, in another 50 years, you could be an elder. And younger generations, and this is kind of funny that this happens because the builder generation came into leadership immediately after World War II. There were 20-somethings and early 30-somethings from the builder and silent generations who took over the church and changed it to be like they needed it to be. But now they don't want to let younger people come in because we might not be able to trust them with the church. So I always like to ask this question: why do elders have to be elderly? It's okay to have elderly elders. I've been an elder when I was elderly, and that's great. But why does everybody who's got to have to be elderly in order to be an elder? If you look at the New Testament, you know that some of the people in there that were designated as elders and deacons and so forth were 20-somethings. Some of them were probably in their teens because people got married early in those days. By the time they were 15, they had a family. They didn't have to prove themselves and wait until they were 65 to be able to hold that highest office in the church. So modern churches tend to withhold that, whereas postmodern churches tend to grant authority. And if you go into one of the churches that's loaded with Gen X and Gen Y people, you'll see Gen X and Gen Y people in all the offices. They're all there doing their thing that they couldn't do in a mainline church someplace because we said, we're not sure we can trust you with this yet. Mainline churches modern churches tend to be concerned about management, whereas postmodern churches are more concerned about vision and where that vision might take you in the name of the Lord. Go to the next one. After pragmatism. Okay, membership versus discipleship. Membership implies that you have joined an institution. And so after World War II, when the builder generation took over the church, membership became very important. You made your confession of faith, you were baptized, and that's how you joined the institution. But postmodern churches are more concerned about discipling people, about helping them learn how to become Christ-like in their lives. So when you make your confession of faith and you're baptized, it's not so much that you're joining an institution as it is you are becoming a part of the spiritual body of Jesus Christ. But you can see how builders, with their love for institutions, and silence, with their love for institutions, have a tendency to identify membership with discipleship. But you also know, as you think about it, it ain't the same thing, right? I mean, we've got huge numbers of people who are members of our congregations who, on a day-to-day basis, would have a hard time being seen as people who are living Christ-like lives. So, do you continue to have members and insist that people be members of the institution before they can be an officer in the church? Well, it's some territory that's, you have to work through that. You got to talk that through. In my personal opinion, I think if you attend regularly and you give regularly, you're a part of that institution, and you have a right to serve in just about any capacity in the life of the church. Likewise, if you're not active in participation and in contributing, then it doesn't matter if your name's on a roll someplace. You're not really much of a member. So those are things that you kind of have to think about. Dependency versus capacity. Modern churches like to keep people dependent on the leadership because they're easily managed when they're dependent on the leadership. Whereas postmodern churches are constantly trying to develop the capacity of their people, enhance their knowledge and understanding and their skills and so forth, giving them more and more as they wish and are able to take it on more and more to take care of. These words begin to look the same, don't they? Control versus empowerment, same kind of issue. Democracy versus discernment. So one way to think about, are we a modern or a postmodern church, is to ask, okay, how much of our life is described by the left side and how much of our life is described by the right side? And how could we begin to move from the left to the right? Not overnight, but over a couple of years, how could we begin to really move from the left side to the right side? So the legacy of the builders' generation, I mean, they reshaped the church when they came home from the war. Before they got there, churches tended to be run by a small board of old men. And after they reshaped the church, they began to have direct democracy. What that means is, rather than representative democracy, they established with their institutions boards that were practically congregational meetings when they gathered, because there were so many people on the board. And what's that? Yes, you've heard of it, in a land far, far away. The idea there was, I think, that if they're on the board, builders experience God through institutional life. They love institutional life, so let's give them a job in institutional life, and that will hold them close, and they'll be happy. And for builders, that's largely true, and for silence, who are so much like them. But for younger people, they don't like to go to meetings where the same stuff is talked about over and over again. And when you've got a board of 100 people, it's really hard to come up with a new idea or to develop an idea fully. It's going to end up being a leader or two that brings an idea forward. It's not the group that's going to come up with a great idea. And these young people then, if they're on a board like that, they're not going to get a chance to really contribute. All they're going to have a chance to do is to vote yes or no when the question that's been brought by the leadership comes. I've consulted with lots of mainline churches where the board membership was larger than the average attendance of the congregation. Organizations do so much better if they have a relatively small board that can be representative of people, but where you can have real dialogue between 12 or 14 people, all the perspectives represented there, but a dialogue which can result in some consensus-building proposal, which can then be acted on by the board. And if it's really important, then take it to the congregation and say, this is what the board thinks. Are you okay with this? Okay, so anyway, direct democracy, large boards versus consensus. Functional committees. I know this comes as news to a lot of folks, but functional committee is not found in the New Testament. This This is found in industrial America, beginning in the 1940s, 1930s. And so the church has adopted the functional committee system, again, as a way of getting as many people involved in the cranks and tools and wheels of institutional life. And so we tend to have these, we have all the work divided up into 10 or 12 committees, and we have how many ever people we can get on those committees. And I call it the dysfunctional committee system, because it's kind of run down to a place where there's very few functional committees that actually function. Now, World War II generation and silent generation knew how to make those committees work pretty well. They knew how to set an agenda. They knew how to combine some spiritual nourishment along with the business and so forth. But younger generations don't respond to that very well, and certainly don't know how to do it themselves. They're not interested in those kind of meetings. So if your board is too large, if you've got too many committees with too many people on them, that's a warning right away to younger generations that this is an old style church. Traditional worship and music is also a part of the legacy of Builder's generation. And personally, I'm fine with that. I love traditional worship and music. The problem is that most of us have been doing traditional worship and music for so long that you couldn't experience the Holy Spirit through that hymn singing or through that liturgy if you had a guide dog. I think I'm mixing metaphors there. There's no life in it. Instead of singing the hymns the way we used to sing them when we were young people, we're looking at our shoes. We probably don't even have the hymnal in our hand, or if there's a screen, we're not looking at it. And we may not even at all be singing. And what it comes across to young people as is dead. So if you're going to do traditional worship, do it like you mean it. Crank up the amperage, not in a false or pretentious way, but just get in the room. Be mindful of what you're doing in this worship service. It's not just something you do so you can get home and get the roast out of the oven or get to wherever you go for lunch. We're taking this hour to be with God and each other in God's presence. Let's be there and let's do it right. Okay? So just crank up the quality. Because otherwise, young people can't detect the presence of the Holy Spirit in the room. And builder churches tend to be pastor-centered. Builders love to have a general practitioner for a doctor who would come to their house when they got sick. They hate systems like we have now where everybody's a specialist and you have to make appointments and you have to make sure that your specialists are talking to each other so they don't kill you. Likewise, they liked congregations that had a head pastor who was clearly the head pastor, and good old Dr. So-and-so was the guy, almost always the guy. And now, builders and Gen X want to be a part of the action. They want to be a part of a community, not that's sitting in rows looking forward so much as be a part of a community that's sharing the work, sharing the life with each other. So a lot of our churches are generationally obsolete. They were shaped by the World War II generation to meet their needs, but there really haven't been much in change in these churches since they were formed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. There's been technical adjustments, but nothing very deep. And interestingly, we restructured as a denomination in 1968. And Ronald Osborne, one of the fathers, if you will, of the restructure process, said he recognized what was going on. It's 1968, you know. We'd been working at it for about 10 or 15 years, and we restructured just in time to be obsolete as a denomination. So we're still organizing by democracy and those other kinds of terms that we had in the polarities. So we're trying to find our way forward as a denomination into the postmodern era. How can we organize ourselves as a denomination in a way that better suits the times in which we live? Okay, so let's look at the last, I think it's the last slide here. Oh, yeah, pick that one up real quick. Transformation doesn't necessarily mean forsaking the older generation's needs in order to meet the needs of younger generations. But it does require being flexible enough to address the needs of younger generations as well as those of the older generation. So your first answer when somebody says, could we do this a little differently? Your first answer can't be no, can't be done. We've always done it this way, you know, last 7 words of the church. You gotta have some conversation and find a way forward that can meet both your needs. Next slide. Next slide. You don't have to change everything. Just the stuff that's killing you. Okay? That's all. Just the stuff that's killing you. So go on past these 3 slides. Institutions follow a natural life cycle, including new churches. They're born like a movement, then they institutionalize as they get bigger, because they have to in order to get the job done, and then eventually they bureaucratize. And bureaucracy is not a bad thing. Try having a school system without a bureaucracy, for example, or a military without a bureaucracy. On the other hand, next slide, bureaucracies are supposed to be such that these bureaus face outward, seeking to meet the needs of the institution. But they do have a human tendency, talk to John Calvin, they do have a human tendency to begin to worry about life inside the box rather than in how that bureau serves the mission of the whole. So you got to keep your bureaucracy fresh. Okay, next slide. If we did a third session, I'd do it on this slide, but we don't have a third session. So let's go to the next one, and the next one. This is my favorite cartoon about the church. Was that today? That's Noah's Ark there sailing off. Okay, next slide. Next slide, and the next slide. Okay, so toward transformation. What do you need to do? Number one, own the fact that you've had a rich history and heritage here at Northwood. This church has done tremendous good in the world and in this community through the years. So own that and be proud of that. It's marvelous. But you're also now in a different age than you were before, a different era. So the kinds of things you probably need to do, I'm guessing because I don't know you that well, but if you're like a lot of other disciples' churches I've seen, you probably need to reduce the amount of time that's spent on governance, including boards and committees, and instead spend your time directly engaged in mission. Engage your neighborhood and your community in a missional way. And that means, first of all, find out who lives out there. Who are these people? What do they need? And how does that match up at all with our gifts? What could we be doing to serve those people? So the question is not, how can they serve us? How can they come and help save our church? The question is, how can we lose our life for their sake by serving them? Because that's where we find new life, is by reaching out in mission. Third thing is, teach the faith. Postmoderns want to know the story of the faith and cannot be reasonably expected to commit themselves to the Church of Jesus Christ if they don't know who Jesus is or what he taught. So teach it and model it. And fourth, be a fully welcoming community. As I like to put it, true community, deep Christian spirituality, and a passion for justice. And the limits of diversity, which we talked last week, were the limit to be able to provide diversity. If someone can't live in a diverse climate, then they can't be part of a diverse climate, whether they're on the left or the right or wherever. You all have to be able to give some space to people who understand things differently than you do, and to work together towards some common learning and some common understanding, even though you won't necessarily end up in exactly the same place on any given issue. But you have to be fully welcoming. So those are the four things I would name off the top of my head that would be helpful. And I think the first thing I would recommend that you do is do that community survey to find out who's there. It's probably over 5 o'clock, isn't it?
Thank you, Dr. Hamm. You hear me, I don't know, that's not a millennial tendency, but I always only call you Dr. Hamm. And when I was in seminary, I always called my professors Dr. So-and-so and Dr. So-and-so. I've been a bit old school in that respect because of how I was raised. You picked up on some of the stories I've shared about my childhood, but I was raised in something like a time capsule by parents that were concerned with keeping me safe from the world. The advantage to that it gives me, your pastor, is I actually have a streak of nostalgia for some of the things you miss. Many millennials don't have an interest or even a streak of nostalgia for the sort of things that you experienced when you were growing up. I watched a lot of black and white television. I don't know all of the cultural references, but I was steeped more in that than some others. So I have a passionate desire to be a part of a process like what I just heard described, where 20-somethings and 30-somethings after World War II were the builders in their church. I have never seen that. I have never seen that with my own eyes. I've never been a part of a church like that. I've heard about churches here and there, but by and large, I've never been a part of a process like that. And it's what I passionately want to be a part of, but with you. I don't want to do what so many others in my generation have done, which is isolated themselves and cut themselves off from the other generations and stopped talking and chased down their own aesthetic tastes and desires and created a church in their own image. I want a church that's made in the image of all of us. And for now, a church that's fully represents the diversity in the body of Christ. And for now, it's fairly lopsided. It represents the interests and tastes of previous generations. So I don't know what's next in the church. I have a conviction in my heart that there is God's Spirit on the move, calling us to new ideas. I just simply haven't had all of those ideas yet, and the thing is, I am not supposed to. I hope, will discover these things together. This is my hope to be the beginning of a much longer conversation where we will continue at Northwood to talk along these themes together with more meetings where we'll decide what we call these groups or these opportunities to gather to talk about the sort of things that we just learned about and who we hope to become. Thank you for coming this evening. Thank you for giving 4 hours spread out over 2 weeks to sit and listen to a lecture. It may be my bag, but I realize not everybody likes to sit and listen to lectures. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to put this recording after I've edited it and cut out some of the dead space and the gaps and the breaks. It'll be online if you wanted to go back and hear something again. If you have any other questions, you could reach out to me, and I can also convey them to Dr. Hamm. He also has a book that he has written about these topics that I have in my office that I had meant to order multiple copies for, haven't yet. But if you're interested in that, let me know and we can get you a copy. I get the feeling that you want to sit there for another 3 hours. Why don't I dismiss this with prayer and we'll be on our way. Almighty God, you have watched all that was described here, and you also have been watching what was described here over the course of decades. And you have seen what has come between these generations and what has fragmented our culture. And you have called your church into being to be in part an answer to these divisions, an answer to our need for a collective sense of belonging and direction and purpose. And we here at Northwood are a part of that desire to seek and to find out what new iterations of the church will happen. And we want to be a part of that. And we, in this time of transition, feel disoriented. And God, I pray that you will hold us through the disorientation and the anxiety of the changes, but then will also give us a positive vision forward so that while the work may be difficult, we can go forward because we can hopefully, in hope, see where it is that we are heading. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. May he guide us. In Jesus' name, amen.